Welcome back to Keeping Ag Real. This is Jenny Schweigert. I'm a mom, wife, chauffeur, sheep and cattle herder, front porch obsessor, and your host. Keeping Ag Real is part of the Farm and Rural Ag Network, your one-stop shop for the best agriculture podcasts and vlogs. Visit www.farmruralag.com for more information. Today's episode is sponsored by Bayer Crop Science, providing access to crop protection safety data through their new transparency initiative. So what does this mean? It translates to Bayer sharing the scientific data they're using when evaluating plant protection products, and they want to share that with you. Google the words Bayer and transparency to quickly find the new website and learn how you can love the facts. This week's episode, I have Jayson Lusk joining me. We are at the 2018 Bayer Advocacy Issues Forum. This is the expert. This is the guy that knows why we eat what we eat. And that's really kind of the million-dollar question that everyone in the food scene is trying to answer. Your experience spans 25 years plus, and you've had an extraordinary career and opportunities, experiences that you've had. As the food landscape has changed over the last 15 years or so, what's the most impactful trend or diet that you have seen in the food space?
Overall, I would say, rather than just picking on one trend per se, I would just say the ability of the consumer to influence the food sector has definitely grown over the last 10 to 15 years. That, there was a time, at least historically, that farmers didn't have to think too much about the final food consumer.
Right.
But those days are well behind us. And making sure that somebody's going to want to buy that product at the end of the day is certainly something I think that's changed over the last 10 to 20 years. And, it manifests itself in all kinds of things, whether it's non-GMO or gluten-free or what have you, or even, high-protein diets. But I think the reality is that the consumer has become a much stronger and more driving force in the food sector.
And so the consumer, they're really tuned into what they think is healthy. Who are some of those food police that they're listening to?
Sure. Well, in general, I think about the food police as just a group of people who seem to think they know better about how we should be eating and what kinds of food policies we should be proposing than you or I, the food consumer. So in general, it's a set of journalists and NGOs that are often very critical of our modern food production system. And again, we like to get advice from people on how to eat, and sometimes some of us even pay nutritionists or get coaches to help give us advice. But I think what's different about the food police is their willingness to use policy to affect how everyone is eating, and I think that's where I draw the distinction in my mind.
The advocacy, I guess, of food police has grown just as advocacy in agriculture has grown. One example that comes to my mind is Vani Hari, the food babe. Is there one situation or person like her that has become very prevalent online that you think that a great majority of people are really listening to? And the reason I'm asking the question is definitely farmers and ranchers, in my experience, and agribusiness professionals, they know who she is. They've heard of her. But when I'm talking to my friends who have nothing to do with agriculture or the food scene, they've never heard of her. Is there really an impact that she's making? I know she's got 1.2 million followers on Facebook. Or is this something that ag and food is actually stirring and making larger?
Well, I think there is an element of truth to what you're saying, that we do tend to pay, the old saying that the squeaky wheel gets the noise. So the people making the loudest noise tend to get a lot of attention. So it is important to ask, how many people are really being represented there? And you're right, there's probably 10, 20% at most of food consumers that are really, passionately, in tune, with things about whether it's organic or cage-free eggs or what have you. But that doesn't mean that people aren't sympathetic to the movement. And I think rather than focusing on an online personality, really, for me, one of the people that's been most influential in driving a lot of this movement is Michael Pollan. Mm-hmm. He's not a household name, and he's not as active on social media, but he's sort of really helped provide the philosophical undercurrent, the philosophical reasoning for why the quote-unquote natural movement is good, and sort of the provided the critique of modern commercial agriculture, I think is a current that's underlying a lot of the sort of disconcerting things that people have or sort of feel about the food system. And so whether it's the food babe or sometimes even people like Oprah or Gwyneth Paltrow,
yes.
I mean, they're not all saying the same thing, but there is this sort of common undercurrent that this sort of appeal to a romantic traditionalism
yes.
that they sort of prey on, and that most of the ills with our food system somehow come about because we've somehow messed with nature, and if we could get ourselves back to like a 1940s sort of agriculture. And it's a deeper criticism than that, and it's something I talk about in the Food Police book. But there's it's related also to people's views about the world and about civilization versus nature, and it relates to people's views about sort of government involvement in food. And so for some people, not all, but for some of these folks, there's a sort of critique about capitalism that's also an undercurrent that's driving a lot of these food debates. But I think in my mind, the most influential person there has been Michael Pollan, because even though he had, the Omnivore's Dilemma was written back in 2004, I don't know what percentage of college kids have had to read that, but
right.
very large. And so you think about taking young people that are impressionable
right.
and really forming their beliefs about who they are and what they think in life. I think that book has had an incredible impact. And
you hear, people like Gwyneth Paltrow or the Food Babe or even Kimball Musk. I've heard each of those individuals mention Michael Pollan.
Yes.
And so I do see that as a driving force as well. I do have a question. When you said the romanticism of farming, I want to know your opinion of what we do on our little small 5-acre farm. I do get controversy from it. So my in-laws have a dairy farm, and they milked up until 2013, and then there's still corn and beans and everything. So it's their main income. It always has been. On our 5-acre patch, which is south of them, we are raising sheep. We did raise chickens. We are trying to make a profit. It is more, I guess, than just a hobby. It's also for the kids for 4-H. But it's an excellent way to bring people to our farm because that's what they want, or that's what they think they want. And then we can explain why so-and-so is doing this. When we had chickens, the big deal, they wanted our eggs because they were brown. And so having to go through all those conversations over and over, and then talk about the safety and talk about the time that it takes to get eggs to the store. The other aspect of it is explaining and connecting them with larger farmers that maybe are different, like hogs or all corn and beans or things like that. Are we using a good approach?
In some ways, I would love to do a study on this. So I have to just answer with my gut and not my scientist hat. But first, I would say, the ability to use those things as a conversation starter sounds to me like a great idea. And so that having conversations there's really little room for that to go wrong. So I certainly applaud you in using your smaller scale animal agriculture to do that. I can just say for me personally, I had 4-H and FFA animals growing up, and it certainly influenced how I think about animal agriculture and the fact that it's not very romantic. When you have to go out there and shovel manure and when animals die from sickness or from a coyote attack, these things make you appreciate the ability of animals to have living conditions where they're protected from the weather and where they're protected from predators. So it certainly influenced my thinking, even though it was very small scale. Now it's very different than having thousands of animals, but I think for me it had an influence. But I've had debates about this sort of with my students, and I would love to do a study on that. The sort of, for example, does a backyard garden make you more or less likely to think favorably about sort of plant protection, pesticides? It could go either way. Farming or planting a small garden is very different than having thousands of acres to farm. You can pick off the bugs by hand in a small patch. I know, and for my boys, we had a little backyard garden just because I wanted them to see. Well, I wanted them to see how to grow food, but really what we learned was how not to grow food.
Well, true. And that's what I joke about sometimes on social media is bring somebody here so they can see why we have done all of this work in technology and innovation, because this is an example, perfect example of why we need innovation. But even, 5 acres, so we use Roundup, and we were criticized by a lady in a nearby town on Facebook because we were using Roundup, and she's a beekeeper, and she felt that we were killing bees. So even on that small scale, that was a good learning experience, and I was able to, I think that's really where my interest in bees started, and I was able to start attending different bee events and learning a little bit more, and then I had facts, and I had, this scientist, this is what they have found, and did you know that back in the, war years, that's when honeybees really, spiked because all the gentlemen were out fighting. They weren't in the fields making sugar, so the women started trying to find a sweet way of flavoring food with honey. And so, yes, after all of that, after the war was over, there was a huge decline because then we went back to growing sugar in the fields. And those are things that a beekeeper, I guess I shouldn't assume, would know. She had no clue of the historical record keeping that has been done since the beginning of the 1900s. So that was a really good learning experience, but it got her to the point where she would actually talk to me about Roundup.
Yeah.
Before that, she wouldn't even talk to me about anything behind the safety of Roundup.
I think that sort of shows the level of conversation often, there's sort of these flashpoints, whether it's Monsanto or Roundup, they wind up in the news, and so that people fixate their attention on that. But it's a herbicide, not a pesticide.
Right.
And but it's a quote unquote chemical, so it must be terrible. It's great that you're able, again, to use that as an opportunity to create a conversation. Sometimes those are tough conversations because you got to go back and do your own homework and try to learn what the facts are. And sometimes things we believe aren't right either.
Right.
But I think that's really throughout a lot of what I've been trying to do here is, it's not to advocate for ag producers per se or consumers, but to really advocate for the science and to make sure that people know the science well, and then whatever choices people make, that's sort of up to them. But hopefully people will be able to do that with the best information that we have.
That is a good segue into agriculture advocacy. I've been involved in agriculture advocacy since about 2009. In the beginning, I didn't know what I was doing. I was a mom blogger.
None of us know what we're
doing.
True.
Yes.
We're just figuring it out as we go.
Exactly. Really, if you look back historically, the advocacy movement on social media began in 2008. As I was working in agriculture advocacy, one of the questions I was often asked is, how do we know if this is doing anything? How do we know if this is making an impact? And that's probably one of the most difficult questions to answer. Are there tools in place today which are able to measure that impact?
That's a tough question to answer. I think what we know is that certainly media discussions have impacts on demand, and we can see it in the research I've done, for example, in meat demand. That particularly at the level of the meat, not social media, but sort of more general mainstream media, that those we can find correlations between stories on certain topics and whether it'll increase or decrease demand. So we know that matters, and I think there's more anecdotal evidence, but certainly the discussions sort of on social media do influence that larger media discussion. So I think there's reason to suspect it matters. I could just speak for me personally, and that is, I had been doing mainly academic work for 15 years or so. Not a lot of public outreach, mainly just writing to other academics, but doing a lot of consumer research and food demand studies. And I had the sense that I should be engaging more on these topics and on a broader level. So I created a Twitter account and started blogging. And what I have found is, and I'm maybe in a little different position than others because I have an academic record and sort of these credentials of being a professor, but mainstream media will reach out to me often, based on a blog post or what have you. And so that, suggests to me that they're paying attention to what certain people are writing, and they would have never reached out to me had I not been willing to be out there having something to say. And so again, just within my life experience, I can tell for me personally when I decided to start trying to communicate in a more public way with a more general public, that it had a big impact on who would reach out to me and ask my opinion or ask me to help them find some resources. So I like to think that matters.
Right.
We'll sort of see. I think one of the best stories was several years ago when the New York Times had a conference called Food for Tomorrow, and it had Mark Bittman and Michael Pollan. And Mark Bittman, who's at the time was a columnist for the New York Times, he started off that conference, and he basically, I don't remember the words exactly, but it was essentially something like, we're at war, and the war was against modern commercial agriculture, and it was a pretty fire and brimstone sort of talk. And then sometime during that conference, I don't know all the details, but there were some real life producers, large scale animal agriculture producers that decided to engage and to participate in a session there and talk about what they were doing and why they were doing the things they did. And I thought really one thing that was really telling was the closing session there. So I was not there in person, but you could listen online.
Sure.
And at the closing session, Mark Bittman, he said, well, one thing I realized is that we're all in this together. And the tone of his discussion was very different. Now, he still is an ardent critic of modern agriculture, but I think that does show you when you're in the room and you're having a discussion, that matters a lot more than just railing against some faceless person out there that you're envisioning with the most evil of intentions.
Right.
And so I think there are several anecdotal things to suggest that there's impact and influence there. Main reality is that people are, it's frustrating because in some cases because people are much more interested in food and ag and where their food comes from these days. So there's a lot more misinformation, but at the same time, at least people are interested.
Right. That's true.
And
that's
so it's
true.
a great opportunity. And so what I will say to some farmers is, you're being talked about,
right.
So you might as well at least, get in the conversation.
True. I think that social media will always have a place. I think that the power of one-on-one conversations in person is much larger than what we give it credit for. And I had helped with the inaugural Illinois Harvest Dinner a couple of years ago, and we actually took a poll beforehand and after, and we increased the trust in farmers and the food system by 80% just from that 2 hours of time having farmers spread sporadically on the different tables with 100 people. So that in person, that's something you can measure. The social media side, I think that maybe that's still something we just can't grasp on an objective level, but subjectively, as you said, we can look at, what types of responses are we getting and receiving.
Well, certainly on Twitter, there's a lot of tribalism. Everybody's following their own camp and tribe, and we like to hang out with other people who think the same as us. And so everyone has to be wary of that, and at least make sure that you're sometimes paying attention to somebody who might disagree with you, because occasionally they might be right. And so that is a big problem with social media, is the way the sort of insular nature of it, and how it kind of feeds the tribalism is something I think we should be wary of.
So I'm going to change direction just a tad bit. Later today, you're going to be addressing the 2018 Farm Bill outlook. Are there specific pieces which you feel are going to possibly have a negative impact on relations between agriculture and the general public? And if so, what are those pieces that we should be paying attention to?
I don't see a lot that's changing in terms of Farm Bill per se that bears on the sort of consumer versus producer relationship. I do think in general, one thing that I would say is, agriculture, the sort of word advocate almost paints agriculture as a special interest group. And I think that's one thing I would probably caution producers on. It's okay to defend the things you do, but you can be come across as looking very defensive. And we all want support for the things we do, but I would just, if I had any words of advice, it would be to be cautious that you could just come across as looking like any industry trying to protect itself. And I think that's particularly true that still the Farm Bill mainly is an output that's governed by the political interactions of farm commodity organizations and the rural legislatures. But that dynamic is really changing, and it's changing over time. And we saw that with the last Farm Bill, that it took much longer to pass, that we went a couple of years past the deadline. I wouldn't be surprised if that didn't happen again. Yeah. And one of the reasons for that is there are many more stakeholders at the table wanting their piece of the pie, if you will. Right. And so that the sort of food movement, while historically they have not had a big impact on farm policy, they would like to.
Right.
And probably given our current administration, they're not likely to probably have a big impact on this round of farm policy. But I could certainly...
You don't say.
Yeah, but I could certainly imagine a day when it's really much more of a food policy bill than a farm policy bill. In some ways, it's already become that. 80% roughly of the spending the USDA is going to SNAP and food assistance programs. So really, it is a food bill.
It is.
Not a farm bill in terms of dollars. So, So I think trying to think about things in those policy prospects that don't, that you don't come across just looking like a interest group looking for protection from competition, I think was, something I'd be a little cautious of.
So I guess 2 follow-up questions from that. I would say that you would agree that there is a stigma around the term advocate. Mm-hmm. How can we get past that? Yes, do I advocate for agriculture? Do I communicate about agriculture to outside of our community? Absolutely. Do I think it's an important piece? Absolutely. Is there a problem with Bayer calling their program advocate? No. The problem is that we have all gotten so wrapped up in that word, and so much time and experience has been spent on that rather than actually talking to people outside the echo chamber. Would you agree with that?
I would wholeheartedly agree, and I think some people might laugh to hear me say this, but if anything, I really consider myself a consumer advocate because really in a lot of my writing, I'm trying to advocate for freedom of choice for consumers,
right,
for food and ag technologies, because I view those technologies as being beneficial to the consumer, to keep food prices low, to use fewer resources so that we have more for tomorrow. And so I think about the things I'm trying to advocate for really is on the behalf of the consumer.
Right.
Yeah. And so that's really, I have this newer book called Unnaturally Delicious. And what I tried to do in that book was talk about, what are the sort of, food and agricultural innovations and how can we talk about them in a way that the consumer sees the benefit of them, because that's ultimately what drives the value here, is that somebody at the end of the day wants to buy it because it's doing something good for them.
Exactly.
And so, sometimes we'll buy things that are good for us. If it's, on the farm, if it saves time and labor and input prices, you'll certainly buy some technologies, but that's for you. And so, but if you want to try to convince somebody else, you got to think about what's in it for them. And so I think that's the way I kind of think about the advocacy piece of it.
I love that. I hadn't thought of it in that way before, and so I appreciate you offering that, and I hope more people will hear this and also see that aspect of it, because we are really trying to help the consumer and the general public understand what's going on in the food system. So I appreciate that. So one more question. I'm going to go back. I haven't had a chance to read the new book yet. I do have it. But the food police, you had mentioned an experiment, and we had talked about this in a Periscope that we did earlier. You mentioned an experiment which talks about Halloween candy and how the word free can impact society. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how it correlates with doing the right thing with placing a value on something?
Sure. Off the top of my head, I probably won't be able to remember all the details, but if I remember correctly, in this study, this researcher had basically gone door to door with some kids and either offered to buy candy or give candy away, and in some cases it was just for a penny. In other cases they said it was free, and they found a much bigger impact when it was advertised as free versus say even just a penny. So this particular author had claimed that just use of the word free can have this big effect, and that as a result we should use that word free to promote other kind of social causes. In his case, he was arguing that if we had certain health
mammograms,
mammograms, and advertise them as free, that people would be much more likely to use them. And so the broader context for why I chose to write about that was this is another chapter on this whole field of study called behavioral economics, which essentially shows that people are not always very rational in our choices. That's not terribly controversial, I think, to most normal people, maybe only to economists. Well, this sounds strange. So in this chapter, I talk about the fact that there's this growing field of behavioral economics, what it means, and but really what I sort of try to draw out though is the implications, some of the philosophical implications that have come about from this line of research, which sort of suggests if people are not sort of smart enough to choose for themselves, then somebody smarter should choose for them. So there's an element to this behavioral economics research, and I do research that people would probably classify as behavioral economics. So I think it's undoubtedly true that we make mistakes sometimes, but the interpretation, though, that as a consequence of that we should put a quote unquote expert in charge of our food choices, I think is a logical leap that isn't always accurate. And so in the case of these the study with the free chocolates, I use that as an example, that here's a researcher doing, an interesting study with Halloween candies, but all of a sudden makes a conclusion that if we just did this and made mammograms free, then we would save healthcare costs, by X billions of dollars. And that's a huge leap of logic. And yet you see some of the same kinds of thinking when they do little studies with food and say, okay, therefore we should ban this or prohibit that really the science itself doesn't support a lot of those claims, and that really there's a sort of philosophy underlying a lot of that's based not on science. But we're convinced
that it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, there's sort of this veil of science that is used to promote it, but it's not. Again, it's a little bit of a logical leap, I think, in my mind. And so I think really at the end of the day that with regard to a lot of these food choices, it's not to say we don't have some food problems. We do. We have some problems with obesity and diabetes and some other things. If we decide or we even adopt the mantra that these are things outside your control and the experts are here to solve it, it sort of undermines the belief that we should take some personal responsibility. Not to say that everybody's health outcomes are because of poor choices they made. There could be other genetic drivers there too. But I am saying that if we don't feel like we have any volition, like any control over if it's just fatal, then it's just fatalism. Well, I can't do anything then. And so I don't think that's really the message we want to give to people either.
I think we definitely need to, as a society, each individually need to be advocating for ourselves more instead of trusting the things that we read. And that's what Keeping Ag Real is about, is going to the core and actually finding out what those facts are, and then kind of, studying the behavior that leads up to why they have reposted something on Facebook that they really know nothing about. And the bottom line is that we are a society of convenience. We don't want to go out there and do the work and find the information. So we need to, I think, somehow change that mindset so we are advocating more for ourselves. And I'm just as guilty as the next person. Yeah,
this is crazy. All this, talk in the news about Russian meddling in our elections. I don't know if you saw this, but there was a story where actually they planted a story over Thanksgiving about a food safety outbreak. That it was totally false, but it was retweeted like thousands of times, and then somebody actually wrote a real news story about it. But it was these Russians, they were just planting this story about people getting sick from eating at a Walmart, that it caused a food safety outbreak. But yeah, here we are.
And was that to take the attention away from?
I don't know what the purpose was, other than just to create chaos, undermine trust, maybe in our institutions and food systems. Like I thought to myself, well, if I would have seen that story, would I have retweeted that? This seems like something I might have done uncritically without thinking about it. So I think you're right. We probably should all work to be a little less gullible and a little more concerned about sort of the truth of what we're saying.
Amen. Well, thank you so much for spending
thanks,
so much
Jenny.
time, and I look for what you have to offer later on today during the Advocacy Issue Forum.
Sure.
So it was great to meet you in person. The last thing I'm going to have you do, which no one will be able to see, but definitely have you autograph my copy of The Food Police.
Happy to do it, Jenny. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thanks, everyone, for listening to this episode of Keeping Ag Real. You can visit the website at www.keepingagreal. You can also follow me on Twitter at Jen Schweigert, as well as at Keeping Ag Real. And don't forget, keep it real.